this month there was a news story that well, it floated again. It floated to the top of many people's consciousness because of the dramatic nature of the headline, and especially the imagery surrounding the headline. A little bit like the previous segment on the San Jose shipwreck. In this instance, it was the discovery of a man who was apparently in almost. And this is, I don't mean this in a flippant fashion, the visual is quite striking, in an almost sort of Looney Tunes-esque style.
Am I the only person who saw that story and saw that picture and thought, wait a minute, somebody's photoshopped this?
Well,
Because it's
exactly.
such an unlikely
It's an astonishing
discovery.
photo where
Yeah.
someone seemingly fleeing the eruption in part of the pyroclastic matter thrust out from the volcano in AD 79 was apparently had their head had the top of their body crushed by a piece of rock, and they died on the ground right there. In fact, the head hasn't been recovered, so it's likely that the head popped off basically. But it's the sort of thing that someone would want to show in a Hollywood movie. It's the sort of thing that would be included in a cartoon, in a sort of a slightly lighter fashion. And so you can't blame people for being attracted to this. For example, I was listening to BBC Radio 6, a music broadcasting radio station in the UK. And a couple of days after archaeologists became aware of this story, they were talking about how this is the top headline, and they wanted music that could reflect this news article. So it really got up there in terms of people's imagination. But I can't help but wonder once again whether is this potentially a little bit exploitative? And the reason why I say this is that so the phys.org article, which I'll put a link to below, is fairly little writing and a heck of a lot of photos of this astonishing imagery.
Yeah.
Is that correct? In the context of, especially, for example, debates that people often like to have about the display of human remains in a museum context, never mind photographs, on a in a scoop, as it were, news article.
That is again, we've been here before with watching briefings. It's one of the nuttiest, knottiest, crunchiest issues I think facing archaeologists, because in the end, and I know I might be unpopular with some of our academic colleagues for saying this, but in the end, I think at root archaeologists are storytellers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We tell stories about the past, and the point is our stories happen to be hopefully very well researched, very nuanced, very thought through. But and the most compelling stories are the human interest ones.
Yeah,
that's why Pompeii has been such a compelling story since it was discovered. It's not just for the cultural influence of those frescoes and the architectural style on the 18th century and the Grand Tour and so on. It's because it's a story of people like us in an extreme situation where it's very easy to picture yourself. What would you have done? Would you have stayed? Would you have run? Would you have taken would you have tried to take the family jewels with you, or would you have just got out as quickly as you could? And then in the end, it's the it's the Roman version of movies like Armageddon or like 2012.
or Towering Inferno. Yeah,
or Towering,
Mm.
it's a real life disaster movie that happened to real people, and
Well,
so
actually,
of course it's compelling. And whenever we meet any of those people, and we'll go on, I think, to talk about the recent Pompeii TV specials on Channel 5 in the UK in a minute. Whenever
we might.
we might. We are going to, because we did prep this, as you said earlier.
No, we won't, because I didn't watch them.
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
I can fill you in. Not seeing something never stopped anybody being a critic.
Okay, we will. I'm going to leave this in, by the way. Yeah.
No, the point is that when it comes to archaeology, these human interest stories, whether it's the muleteer, it's the dog pulling of its chain, all those incredible images that we have fixed in our minds from Pompeii. This is now going to be added to them.
And it's interesting because one of the best for me, one of the best and most evocative stories that was ever told about Pompeii was the Doctor Who episode.
Yes.
Oddly enough, it was actually the first instance where Peter Capaldi was in a Doctor Who episode.
It is, yes.
And he played, was it Caecilius or something? He played a Roman gentleman.
Senator in one of the big houses.
Yeah, and he had to make a choice about his family and all this sort of stuff. And
the Doctor broke the timeline of history.
He did. He interfered. Oh, that naughty Doctor. Oh. But the point, the thing is that the thing I liked about the episode though was that they really highlighted the cultural impact. The fact that I don't know how literal it is, but I know that broadly speaking, events at Pompeii influenced how the Romans understood geology, basically how they understood what was happening underneath them. They in the episode literally come up with the word volcano out of the word Vulcan, the Roman god of the underworld, I think. Yes. And so I think. Yes, there is drama there, and I think sometimes this story can be told in a very effective way that helps you understand that it's not just something that was meant for us to find. It wasn't just oh, look at this perfectly sealed up little town that we can have a look at. Actually, something happened there to people. And this particular instance is particularly dramatic because actually the block that landed on this chap was actually a piece of building. They reckon it was probably a door jamb that was picked up and thrown by the volcano blast. It illustrates the force of it. But
absolutely.
But you talk about the museum and you talk about these dramatic moments, especially because the human remains and the people who were frozen, these casts that were sort of preserved in the lava. Are internationally famous, but also they have somewhat been choreographed as well. I think, as you highlighted to me a couple of days ago, the one where someone is scrunched up holding their hands over their face. It's been shown actually that the hands aren't there. That someone basically made the decision that's the pose that this person was in, and so there is an element here of as I touched on right at the beginning of display, and whether or not this display is always a good thing, whether or not actually there's just as with San Jose and the wreck there, 17 billion is a rather crass thing to be talking about when there are so many issues at play. What should that be one of the ways in which we tell the story of Pompeii? And just before you answer that, this is in the context of this month as well, there being quite a lot of good news coming out of Pompeii in terms of archaeological architecture that's been discovered. So, for example, a street with balconies and colonnades and things has been uncovered recently, and it's interesting how, quite rightly, the human story is being focused on, but I wonder whether. If you look at the photo to word count in, say, the IFL Science article here about the architecture, it's much more balanced. There's much more verbiage there. It's not just the impact,
And in fact, I bring to the party another recent story which broke in the Italian media.
Mm-hmm.
It received some coverage in the English language media, and it's of particular interest to people, to the classicists among us. I'm sadly not one, but I love the idea that these things can happen, and the technologies involved, and that's the recognition through I think it's a burnt scroll from one of the libraries, I think this time in Herculaneum, of a previously unknown text belonging to the Roman writer Seneca the Elder.
Yeah.
Produced by the Seneca. And that's been uncovered by some very clever 3D scanning and software, which has been able to separate individual letters from layers of papyrus. And to make the the text legible again.
Mm.
And I know that there are classicists are really excited at the possibilities of what may be in some of these particularly high status buildings.
Mm.
Um,
Well,
so
supposedly in this instance, it was a super powerful X-ray that they used,
indeed, absolutely.
along with other techniques to sort of construct the image.
Absolutely, and I mentioned the Channel 5 specials that show that aired last week. One of the centerpieces of that again was the human interest story. They were with the cooperation of the Italian cultural authorities. They were CT scanning a number of the Pompeii casts, and for people who aren't familiar with them, perhaps it's worth reminding people what they are. That it was recognised that there were hollows in the solidified volcanic material, the pumice, and the volcanic dust, which effectively created a concrete cocoon around the remains of the people who'd been killed by the explosion and the Noeadon cloud, pyroclastic cloud, and that if they filled these spaces with plaster of Paris, you get a facsimile of the person or object that have been inside, and that created these incredible images of people and animals and so on. The muleteer case that you cited earlier, he's called the muleteer, and you're right. He's crunched up and he appears to be protecting his face. But when they CT scanned it, it appears that the hand bones aren't present. The arm bones are, but the hand bones aren't. And there may be a number of reasons for that. Maybe they weren't preserved in the original space. Whatever. Maybe the casting was incomplete. Whatever. What appears to have happened is that in the 1930s, when the cast was prepared for display, a plaster sculptor put the hands in as I guess maybe as a composition. Did it become at that point a work of expressive art as well as archaeology? Interesting question to ask.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And sort of different to this particular case that we're talking about, which appears to have been excavated archaeologically. And you look at the photographs and so on. It looks like a very well excavated, set of remains.
And
this particular.
Well, and as you say, it looks photoshopped. It almost looked. I literally thought someone had put I thought it was, a meme in the making, which is someone had just put a plastic skeleton on the floor.
Yeah.
And it was going. I didn't think it was real. So it's a striking image, and in that sense, of course, it's going to be used. I suppose I'm just always interested in that balance, I guess. Also, incidentally, just remembered. Sorry, Vulcan, god of fire, furnace, and metalworking.
Indeed.
That's it. Pluto, of course, god of the underworld.
God of the underworld.
Yeah, yep. Pluto. Okay. I mean, in that sense, I don't think there's no hard and fast conclusion that we want to come down on this on. Yeah. It's just an observation and an ongoing. I think conversation about this stuff is interesting as well, because precisely, I think, because the more we examine them, especially the motivations behind the stories that we tell and how we tell them, this will help people to have more fruitful understanding of those stories as well. So and in that instance, I think there is as you hint there, there's an argument to be made that actually there is something legitimate in putting the hands there, because it's almost in that sense it echoes sort of Renaissance sculpture and all sort of stuff. It sort of links in with ideas of trauma, horror, tragedy. There's something legitimately sculptural and artistic there. It's just a question of what that means in terms of the integrity of the story that we're telling and how we're telling it, I suppose. Yeah,
it's complicated.
Absolutely, and it continues to be complicated. I mean, something that popped into my head when we were doing the prep on this was two very prominent British examples of human remains and their handling and the stories that we tell ourselves. One being Richard III at Leicester, and the Scottish soldiers at Durham University, the Jacobite prisoners
from Carlisle Castle, I think, weren't they? Originally?
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not going to go into detail on the Durham example, but what I will say is that I know people who think that story has been flogged like a dead horse to death. Essentially, it's been slightly exploited, shall we say, because ever since Richard III, the story, the dramatic story that can be told with certain human remains, is a very compelling, sellable commodity, especially for struggling, archaeologists who are struggling to especially keep funding coming in. So
Yes.
it is this ongoing complicated relationship between telling an interesting story, and both of those are very interesting stories, but also how we navigate that, and whether or not we stray into potentially a slightly less than savoury presentation.
Yes.
Yeah.